Hello, everybody. This is Bad Left Hook's Connor Rebush, and I am joined here by Scott Christ, the man behind it all, behind the curtain, and the guy who bans you if you misbehave. Basically, the all-holy father of Bad Left Hook. Scott, how are you today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm looking forward to this fight card. We were just saying before we started recording that even though it doesn't have the name value that we might crave for a boxing undercard, that you said you were having some changed thoughts, that you were maybe having some positive feelings towards the undercard. Before we get into this, I should tell everybody, we're talking about the pay-per-view card for Cotto versus Martinez, which of course airs on HBO this Saturday, June 7th. So the first fight on that card, and then Scott, I'll let you get into your thoughts. The first fight on that card is Javier Francisco Maciel versus Jorge Melendez. What are your thoughts on that fight, Scott?
And I'll start talking about this undercard in general. I agree completely with everybody that says that it's not a significant undercard. There's no really notable fights particularly. But yeah, I don't think it's that bad of a card now that Maciel has replaced Yuri Foreman in the actually, I think this will be the second fight on the show, but it doesn't really matter. I think this is likely to be, maybe not likely, but there's at least a good chance that it's going to be an entertaining show. I don't know, it could suck. I mean, it really could, but I don't think it's any worse than the Pacquiao-Bradley pay-per-view, which a lot of people bitched about going in, and that I did too, and I certainly have dumped on this card. But I didn't think that was that bad of a card once it was, all was said and done. It was a pretty entertaining, series of fights leading up to the main event. So
I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's hard to imagine a series of three 12-round fights.
Yeah,
that I would have enjoyed more, actually. There were some good matchups.
Right, and that's, and we said this before the Mayweather show too. It's more about making compelling matchups that are evenly matched, and I think we've got that with this card again. So, I'm not excited about it so much, but I'm tolerant. I'm tolerant of this pay-per-view undercard. So, and I will start with this one. Maciel, I think, bumped up this card's value from an entertainment standpoint, replacing Yuri Foreman by a lot. Melendez is a puncher. He doesn't have a lot of skill, but the guy, he can really crack, especially at sort of this mid-level. If you put him at the top-tier level, I think he'd obviously have extreme problems. He's not a top fighter, but he's pretty entertaining to watch. Maciel, fairly entertaining to watch. So I think this is a nice matchup that we could see a finish in. If we don't, I think it could be a brutal kind of a fight. And again, this is not the most significant fight at 154 pounds, but it's a decent fight. I mean, if you put this on a Friday Night Fights, or you put this on, a lot of the undercards that we see on HBO or Showtime, I think this would be a perfectly fine fight. I certainly don't think this is going to be any worse than the Victor Postol Selçuk Aydin fight we saw as the co-feature for Marquez and Alvarado. So you look at a fight like that gets on HBO, you look at a fight like this on pay-per-view, I don't see any major difference. The thing I do like about this fight is I think we've got a decent chance of getting a finish inside the distance, and if we don't, I think then that proves probably that Maciel is better than Melendez, and I think Maciel has a very good chance of winning this fight. Melendez, he's an okay fighter. Again, he's purely a puncher for the most part, and I'm not sure that he can really outbox Maciel, who's not an elite fighter, but has been in with some world-class, top-level kind of guys, and he's fared pretty well for himself. So, and he hasn't won a lot of those fights, but he has done, fairly well. He's been a respectable opponent for those guys. So, I actually think I like Maciel by a hair in this fight. I'm not, I wouldn't bet anything on that, but I think it's a compelling enough matchup that it's perfectly fine for, a pay-per-view undercard where, frankly, I don't know why we ever expect anything different. I mean, this is pretty much what we get every time, unless with Golden Boy they load up names in fights that aren't that good. So, I mean, that's basically you're picking your poison. You're either getting Adrian Broner against Carlos Molina, which was a pile of crap, but it had a famous guy, or you're getting something along the lines of these fights or what we saw in the Pacquiao undercard, which are better matched fights that are a little more even. Maybe you don't have that top name, maybe you don't have that top level talent, but you have a matchup that is far more even that might make for a better, more dramatic fight.
Who is the matchmaker for Top Rank? Do you know?
Bruce Trampler, I think, does the majority of it, but I don't know who made all these fights, because I know Miguel Cotto's company, I think, made the majority of these fights, and DeBella and Samson Lukovic have some fighters on the card too. But for the most part, I think Trampler is a highly respected matchmaker. He's, I think, one of the best in the business, if not the best. So I'm pretty sure we're going to get some decent fights at the least. Again, it could suck. It could be an awful undercard that bores the hell out of everybody, but you run that risk with pretty much every undercard. So basically what I'm saying is that this is not different. I mean, it's right. More or less the same sort of thing that I think everybody's used to at this point.
I only ask because I hesitate to give Bob Arum too much credit, because I know he clearly doesn't. He has an attitude of, I don't really give a shit if you don't like these fights. This is what you get on a pay-per-view undercard. You're here for the main event. But honestly, you're absolutely right. The past two big undercards I can remember that had name fighters, I mean, even the Amir Khan performance, which was cool, it wasn't as fun and competitive a fight as we all hoped it would be.
Right.
And and of course the Broner fight, man, it was interesting to me because I hoped to see more from Broner, and when I didn't after the first 4 or 5 rounds, I was just completely uninvested. Whereas the Pacquiao undercard was paper championships and overall meaningless fights in comparison as far as name value, but it was fun.
Yeah, and that's the pick your poison here. You're either going to, if you buy into the fact that you need a big name, then great. I'm sure Adrian Broner against Carlos Molina was more entertaining than the Ray Beltran fight or the Jesse Vargas fight at the Pacquiao show. If you're looking for fights, then I think, generally speaking, Top Rank does. But now, look, Golden Boy did do a good job with Khan and Colazzo. That was a better fight on paper than, and Amir Khan performed great in that fight, and that's nothing against, I mean, Amir Khan did what he should have. But, we did get last year, of course, the Garcia-Matisse fight, which was incredibly significant and a very good fight.
True.
So, I think you kind of back into some fights, and I think a lot of the time you're kind of just hoping against hope that you're just going to get something that's watchable.
Yeah. So but looking through these fights in this undercard, I have to agree with you. This one's good. Watching these guys fight histories and getting a sense for their styles, we've got some good stylistic matchups. So you were actually saying this would be the second fight on the card. Which fight is it? Because I'm confused over here. Which fight is our first fight?
The first fight, I think, is Christina Poncher announced this at the weigh-in today, is going to be Andy Lee against John Jackson at 154 pounds. Lee has recently moved down. Andy Lee is a guy who's 29 years old. I think if he was going to break out as a serious contender, it would have happened by now. But a lot of his career was, managed by Emmanuel Stewart, who would hype and promote the guy even when he wasn't fighting. He did a very good job with that. But Andy Lee has just never developed into that well-rounded fighter that he would need to be to perform capably at the top stage. Now, this is not a top stage fight. John Jackson is a decent fighter. I've only seen him, I think, once in action. That was against Willie Nelson. It was on one of the pay-per-view. It was before Chavez Martinez, I believe. It was on the preliminary stream on Top Rank TV. It was a good fight, 10-round fight. I think that might have been maybe the best fight of that entire card. John Jackson lost that fight pretty clearly, but I think you could see some raw potential there and some ability there, and that makes sense. He's the son of Julian Jackson. He's a second-generation fighter. He's got the pedigree. He hadn't been matched tough at all at that point, but he proved that he could hang with a guy like Willie Nelson, who's also fighting on the preliminary bouts on this card. So, and since then he's won a few fights in a row. A couple of halfway decent club type fighters like Tony Hirsch and Cerezo Fort and Jorge Miranda, decent fighters, but not up to the level even of an Andy Lee. Now, if Andy Lee, who's looking to move down to 154, he started kind of taking the baby steps down there from 160. I think he decided after his loss to Chavez in 2012 that he was just not going to compete at the top level as a middleweight. I thought he fought pretty well in that fight, but he got broken down.
He did.
And I think maybe he was looking to gain some sort of physical advantage moving down. Being a 6'2" southpaw junior middleweight is ostensibly a big advantage for him. It just depends, I think, on his fighting style. If he's made some adjustments, which again, it's been a long time. He's been mostly match soft over his career. I think we've kind of seen what Andy Lee is going to be now. I think mostly it depends on what John Jackson is going to be and what John Jackson can be in this fight. If he's improved since the Nelson fight, if he's that same type of fighter, I think it's going to be competitive, hopefully a decent action fight. Andy Lee's a fairly entertaining fighter, especially when he's matched tough. That he tends to respond to that. I mean, against Chavez he didn't, but fights against Brian Vera had been good. His fights against like Craig McEwen, that was a decent fight, and he finished that one. And if this fight is as well matched as it appears on paper, I think this could be a very good action fight. If not, then then I think we find out that Andy Lee is just kind of at this level, if not below, and that he's certainly not going to climb any higher. The guy to watch here in that respect is Jackson, who's 25. He's not really been tested much, but he's looking to step up onto a higher level. A win over Andy Lee could do that for him, and it would certainly be better exposure than he's ever had to this point. So, and I think this is a decent enough fight. I favor Lee on paper, but again, this is another fight like the first one that we talked about that I wouldn't bet anything on it because I think there are questions to be answered on both sides.
I absolutely agree with you, and that's a very good analysis. As you mentioned, Jackson's riding some wins coming into this. He went 5-0 after that loss to Willie Nelson, and it was a competitive loss against a pretty high level guy.
Yeah.
But I do think that Jackson hasn't really proven to me yet. I just recently watched his fight with Jorge Miranda, and again, he's kind of a guy who's complacent to let his athleticism do the work sometimes. And his father could be the same way. Julian Jackson was a guy who really, when you can hit that hard and you're that athletic, why even bother to learn how to box better?
Yeah.
He slept. Julian Jackson put away Harold Graham, who was a far superior boxer. And when you can do that to people who are that good, then there's little impetus to improve. But for Jackson, it's going to be interesting. He's a pretty tall guy too. I believe he's six foot, and Andy Lee is 6'2". Both of them have really long arms. Jackson's arms are even longer than his height by quite a few inches. So it's going to be an interesting contest. The thing with Lee that's always bothered me is that he has this tendency to just kind of, sometimes he fights long, and then other times he just negates his reach and just leans in forehead to forehead with guys who are significantly smaller than him, which I don't understand. And that could be a real risk against a guy with Jackson, particularly because his best punch appears to be his uppercut on the inside.
Yeah.
Stylistically, it's a fun fight. Really, the only question here to me that might make it not a fun fight is how well does Andy Lee handle that weight cut, because he's a big junior middleweight.
Yeah, he is. And, with Andy Lee, he's almost, one of the old jokes was that basically his fighting stance was the Notre Dame mascot, the logo. And, I think he's improved on that a little bit, and I think he's made some adjustments over the years, but again, I think if he was going to break out, he would have by now. And for him, with this fight, it's basically seeing if there's really any future left for him. I mean, 29 is certainly not old, but, we've seen him fall short against some of his better opponents. We've seen him match very soft over the majority of his career. I think he's been kind of puffed up with his record as much as, we talk about guys that come out of Columbia with like 20-0 and 18 KO records. Yeah, but they fought a bunch of guys who were 0-3 or 3-8 or whatever. I mean, it's not quite that bad, but Andy has been stuck for large majorities of his career, as a guy who's kind of dominating the club level. With this fight, John Jackson is a guy who has the potential and has the skills, and I think can certainly beat Andy Lee, unless Andy Lee is, at his best. And we've seen him at his best here and there, especially with, for instance, the Vera rematch. I thought he looked very good. That was still a competitive fight, and Brian Vera is a tough fighter. And he's not a guy that goes away easily, and Andy was able to outbox him in that fight. And I think that's what Andy Lee can do very well, is when he fights to, again, like you mentioned, when he fights with his length and he fights with his reach and he fights, a little bit more on the outside, and he's more of a boxer puncher and not just trying to get in there and bang with guys, because I think we've proven against Chavez especially, we've seen that that's not his game. He was able to outbox Chavez for 4 or 5 of the first 6 rounds, and then he just got completely busted up by a guy who was a little bit bigger, especially in body mass, and kind of had Chavez has more of a desire to fight on the inside, and I think he's more home there. Andy Lee gets there, and I just don't think he knows what to do a lot of the time. And when he does know what to do, which is once you're inside, you might as well fight inside and get into that, but it's just not what he's good at. So if he can do that with Jackson, I don't know how that will work, because again, like you said, that uppercut from John Jackson is a good punch. He's got a lot of power, and I don't know how he'll do from the outside either, because I don't know how good Jackson is from the outside. I mean, we saw him struggle some with that against Nelson, but Nelson's another tall guy, lanky guy who will fight inside if you make him. I mean, he's not afraid to get in there and do it, and Andy Lee's not afraid. He's just not that good at it. So, again, I think this is a pretty decent matchup. It's interesting enough, especially for a pay-per-view opener. I mean, you can't ask for a lot more than hopefully you're getting a good action fight. I mean, nobody loads up undercards looking to make fights where top guys are going to possibly lose. So, with Andy Lee, he's not a top guy, and I think everyone recognizes that. Andy was lined up, of course, to fight Andy Golovkin in April, which fell through, and frankly, if I'm Andy Lee, outside of the money, I'm pretty happy that fell through, because that was not going to be pretty for Andy Lee, and I think with John Jackson, he's more kind of at his level, hopefully, and the weight cut, like you mentioned too, will be a factor one way or the other. I mean, either Lee's going to be fine, and then the fight will play out because he's fine, or it's going to have taken a toll on him. He's never come in this light before. I mean, if he has, it was years and years ago at this point. So it'll be interesting to see how Andy holds up cutting that weight, how he's going to come in shape, not in shape. He's going to be a little drained. He's going to be dehydrated. I don't know. So, I mean, I think we, again, like the first fight, we have a lot to answer on both sides with this fight.
To get over fight for both guys. It'll decide if John Jackson can hang with the top level of the division, even though Lee hasn't proven himself in this division yet. He will be a tough matchup. And for Lee, it will determine if he does still have a chance to compete at the top of the division, or if he will forever be a gatekeeper for the rest of his career. So moving on to the co-main event, this is a fight that I'm actually really looking forward to. It's Wilfredo Vasquez Jr. versus Marvin Sonsona, and this is a rematch of a fight that took place a couple of years ago. In the first fight, Vasquez knocked out Sonsona in the 4th round, and I'm looking forward to this one. I really enjoyed their first fight. Sonsona is a long southpaw, and I do believe he was coming up in at least one weight class. He may have been jumping up from 2 weight classes or something to fight Vasquez the first time, but he's a big guy for the weight class regardless. He's very long, very lean, and he's also a guy kind of like John Jackson. He's not quite as polished. At least he certainly wasn't against Vasquez at the time, whereas Vasquez, who only had 14 fights himself, professional fights himself at that time, fights like a veteran. I think he's a very patient and calculated guy, and he did a really good job of breaking Sonsona, the more physically imposing fighter, down pretty quickly. Once he kind of had a beat on him, he took him apart. How do you see this rematch going?
You know what? I think this is going to be a much different fight than the first one was. I remember watching the first one. That was an integrated sports pay-per-view. It was a small pay-per-view show. Otherwise, it would have had no TV in the U.S. at all. But it was. I remember being intrigued by it because Sonsona was a kid who was really hyped at that point. As again, he was one of the many next Pacquiaos out of the Philippines. But he was very, very young at the time. I mean, he was still basically. I think he was still a teenager, and he was 19 years old. He'd already won a world title at 115, and he beat a pretty decent fighter in Jose Piston Lopez in I think it was 2009. So, and he after that his next fight I think was in Canada. It was in Canada. It was against Alejandro Hernandez. It was just a couple of months after the Lopez fight, and I remember he missed weight, which was, not that surprising. When you're 19, your body starts to grow a little bit quickly, and you're not going to be able to make, again, with him it was 115 pounds at the time, and he weighed in basically as a bantamweight for that fight. So he vacated, and then he fought to a draw. He didn't look like himself. There were a lot of reports at the time that he was having some issues outside the ring, and it was nothing serious. It was basically, a kid that was chasing girls because he's 19 years old. He's got some money. He's had a lot of things handed to him. He made some, out of the ring mistakes from a professional boxer standpoint. But I don't know how invested he was at the time in being a professional boxer. And when he got to Vazquez, who had no hype, despite the fact that he's a second-generation fighter, fighting out of Puerto Rico, and I think he was like 17-0 at the time, but nobody really knew anything about Vazquez right then. And Vazquez turned out to be the more prepared, stronger fighter because Sonsona was coming up, like you said, 2 weight classes, more or less, because he was coming up from super flyweight, which is what he had been preparing to be, up to super bantamweight, and that was for a vacant title, and that's the fight that made Wilfredo Vazquez Jr.'s career, because, again, he wasn't hyped, he wasn't talked about a lot, which is odd for a second-generation fighter out of Puerto Rico. You would think you would hear a lot more about him, but like you said, Vazquez as a young fighter was very patient, very calculated, and a lot of that came because his father didn't really want him to get into the ring, but they decided that if he was going to do that, they schooled him until his dad felt he was ready to go out there and really test himself, and they did that. And so the interesting thing about the first fight was that Vazquez was just better than him, and Sonsona just didn't look completely prepared. Sonsona was, again, a young kid. He was 19 years old. He was a teenager. So, he made some in-ring mistakes that came maybe from not being completely prepared. And what can you do about that other than learn and move on? And I think that's what Sonsona did. He had a little bit of a break after that. He didn't fight for, I think it was at least a year and a half or so. So, once you get that, it's with Sonsona, I think he's in a much better place at this point. I think he looked spectacular in February against Akifumi Shimoda. Third-round knockout win over in Macau. I thought he was very, very good in that fight. And I think that to me, that made me excited to see him come back again because he's still 23. There's a lot of future in this guy if he's dedicated the way that they hoped he would have been at a younger age, which he wasn't. And if he can, and with Vazquez, we're not looking at a guy who's on the upshot anymore. He's 29 years old. I think he's been, I think the word gets overused, but he's been exposed a little bit. He got beaten up and knocked out by Jorge Arce. He lost to Donaire, which was a split decision, which absolutely should not have been a split decision because he got clearly beaten in that fight. And then he lost in Macau last year to Yasutaka Ishimoto, which nobody saw coming. Ishimoto was just kind of a standard Japanese veteran fighter, and Vazquez got beaten in that fight. So with this one, I think the first time around we saw Vazquez as the more patient guy and Sonsona as the young guy who had all the hype, and now I think we've got Sonsona in a better spot mentally, probably a better spot physically, and Vazquez has kind of tapered off and plateaued with wherever he's going to be in his career. And at featherweight, we'll see, I think, a much better fight than we saw at super bantamweight the first time. I don't think Vazquez is going to look better than he did then, and I don't think Vazquez is going to look any better than we've seen him look to this point in his career. Sonsona might, now be that guy that they wanted him to be, and he might now be the guy who's ready to step up and be a top fighter.
I agree with all that. Vazquez, I did not know that about Vazquez's background, but it makes a lot of sense. At the time that they had their first fight, that was Vazquez's 16th professional fight, and it was actually Sonsona's 18th. So Sonsona was actually the more experienced boxer, but Vazquez coming from, as you said, a very schooled background, and that's how I would describe his style. He looks like a second-generation boxer. He looks like somebody who has a very schooled offense, is very patient. He didn't get freaked out by Sonsona's athletic gifts and his reach.
Yeah.
Whereas Sonsona at the time was doing exactly what you might expect a normal fighter with only 18 fights under their belt to do, which is to not measure the range, to expect to be able to knock this guy out who didn't have any hype. And so he was just kind of guessing and throwing these big punches. And then when Vazquez started to counter him, I think it really broke Sonsona's confidence.
Yeah.
And it was a pretty steep decline after Vazquez started to have success. It was like first round, Sonsona did well. Second round, Vazquez did okay. Third and fourth round, Vazquez kind of beat Sonsona up.
Yeah.
And knocked him out in the fourth. So, but I do think Sonsona has come along technically since then, whereas I think that was probably Vazquez's best. That's probably as good as he's going to get.
Yeah, that was probably the peak of, and that was, again, that was a fight that made Vazquez's career, and I think that might have been his best fight to date. After that, they tried to match him a little bit soft, and they sort of misread. I don't think they misread Jorge Arce when they made that fight. I think Jorge Arce did what you would expect Jorge Arce to do. I think they were a little overconfident in Vasquez's ability to beat up on a smaller, older Jorge Arce, who, you know, brought the fight to Vasquez, and he hurt him early, hurt him often. He had him kind of on the ropes in that fight, and Vasquez just never really made the adjustments that he needed to keep Jorge Arce at bay. Jorge Arce is a completely known quantity. He was by then, and he had been for years. And we, you know, it was one of those fights with Arce, and it seems like we've had 5 of them by now, where coming in, everyone goes, okay, well, you know, Jorge should really retire. And then, you know, Jorge Arce comes out and he fights his ass off and he beats somebody. So Vasquez wasn't, I think, mentally prepared for that. And I don't even know if it wasn't that he was mentally prepared. It was just a level that he wasn't quite good enough to be at. I mean, it's not even good enough. It's just that style matchup did not help him in any way. Yeah. And Arce was able to take advantage of the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses in Vasquez's game, and he's got plenty of them. But, you know, and against Donaire, I want to throw this in. I mean, Vasquez clearly lost, but I thought that was one of the fights much earlier than most people were kind of catching on to the limitations of Nonito Donaire, where I thought Vasquez was able to neutralize a lot of what Nonito likes to do, which is Nonito loves throwing that counter left hook, and that's about it. I mean, Nonito doesn't. There's not much to his game. So no. I mean, and I think that fight helped everybody, or it should have at least, see, you know, just kind of how one-dimensional Donaire was and is still. But I mean, you know, Nonito at the time was considered a top 5, top 3 pound-for-pound guy. A lot of people had him second, and I didn't quite see it at the time, and I thought that fight sort of showed exactly why I was kind of reluctant to consider Nonito that truly top-level elite pound-for-pound kind of a fighter, because it's really just the one thing that he's good at, and an opponent will let him do that, like Vic Darchinyan did the first time, and like Fernando Montiel did, and a few other guys along the way that he got to beat the shit out of and then, you know, knock out, and they looked great, and everyone was happy about that, obviously, and they should have been, because it's always very exciting. But with Vasquez and with a lot of other guys, we've seen him sort of, you know, have to take those steps back and try to do something different, and it's just not there for him. I mean, he doesn't have a great right hand. He's not that good defensively. I think he relies on other people to make him good. And I'm rambling about Nonito Donaire right now, but I mean, but it's, you know, and I think that was one of the Vasquez's better fights, even though he clearly lost that fight, because he showed, you know, that he can hang with those top guys, and Donaire is a good fighter. He's a really good fighter. It's just he's not great. But it showed, I think Vasquez was much better losing to Donaire than he was losing to Arce. Now, his last fight that he lost over in Macau to Ishimoto, I thought Vasquez looked kind of terrible in that fight, to be honest. I didn't see anything from him in that fight. His last fight he won, I didn't see the fight, but it was against a low-level kind of opponent. This one, I don't see Vasquez winning this fight. If he does, then, you know, he's back in the mix at 126. But if Sansona wins this, I think we've got a potential legitimate world title contender, a guy who might, you know, sort of throw a wrench into the plans at 126 right now, because I think he's a very, very talented fighter. And with him earlier in his career, again, it was about, he was a 19-year-old kid and he wasn't completely prepared for that. He hadn't, you know, he'd been able to run over most of his opponents by then, and I don't think that's often that good for a fighter, especially if you take them from that level into a huge jump up to the next level. I think that's always going to not, you know, pan out. That's not going to work. So we got to see it in that fight, and I'm interested in this fight. I like Sansona, and I like him pretty big in this fight. I think he might stop Vasquez in the middle rounds, maybe toward the latter portion of the fight. But I really, really like Sansona big in this fight.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think most guys face a couple of gatekeepers, and maybe they falter the first time, and they realize they need a little more seasoning. Sansona has the advantage of knowing exactly where he stands after this, because he gets to fight the same gatekeeper twice.
Yeah.
And the first time, Vasquez ran over him, and I think that he's improved enough. He's gone, let's see, he's gone 4-0 or 5-0. 4-0 with 3 of those being knockouts or TKOs.
Yeah.
Against, decent competition, not incredible, but neither has Vasquez. And Vasquez has struggled against a competition, Ishimoto, who's not that good either. And so, I don't mean to talk trash about Ishimoto, but he's not the kind of guy you would expect to.
No, he's a mid-level fighter. I mean, that's exactly. And Vasquez was brought there to win that fight. I mean, that was not. That was supposed to be kind of a tune-up for him to get back in the mix a little bit, but it just didn't turn out.
And Vasquez being a 29-year-old fighter, good background, good schooling, but I think he's basically a known quantity at this point. Whereas I think we agree that Sansona is still only 23 years old. I mean, he's at this age and at the experience level where he can continue to improve for a good while yet.
Yeah.
And I think that he has. So I guess we're both picking Sansona in this fight, and that brings us to our main event, highly anticipated, somewhat strange fight between Miguel Cotto and Sergio Martinez, two guys who are obviously past their primes, haven't looked as good as they did in their best years in quite some time, and yet a stylistic matchup that really intrigues me, and a fight that means a lot for both guys. And I think recently there was a post featured on Bad Left Hook about fans getting to the Carl Froch party too late, and I think that's the case for Martinez as well. I think this is going to be his big fight. This is going to be the biggest fight of his career ironically, against a guy who is a welterweight. But it's, Cotto's going to bring more eyeballs to a Sergio Martinez fight than Martinez ever could on his own or with any of the normal middleweight opposition. And Martinez is already, it's too late because Martinez is not going to look the way that he would have when he would have captivated people the first time around.
Yeah, I mean, he did well with the Chavez fight, and obviously that was mostly Chavez. This is going to be mostly Cotto, and that's why Miguel Cotto's the A-side. That's why Chavez was the A-side. I mean, it had nothing to do with the titles, which at the time Chavez had been, given Martinez's WBC belt, which was one of my absolute favorite bullshit boxing moments of the last decade. I mean, it was just giant conspiracy of everyone kind of coming together, the WBC and Top Rank and HBO. Everyone wanted to get that belt on Chavez. But with this fight, I was interested today in the weigh-ins. I wanted to see how Miguel Cotto would come in. Cotto came in at 155. Cotto is not a middleweight. Cotto knows he's not a middleweight. He's taking this fight because it was the biggest money fight out there for him other than Canelo. And this is also a chance, which Canelo would not have been, to win a world title at 160 pounds, make some history, win a title in a fourth weight class, and establish himself as, which he already is, but further cement himself as one of the all-time great Puerto Rican fighters. And for Miguel Cotto, that's a big deal. Now, for both of these guys, this is a must-win fight, because, like I said earlier in the week, both these guys are fighting primarily for money now because they're, Cotto's 33 and he's not looking to hang around in boxing forever. Martinez is 39 and his body is giving out on him at this point. So both these guys want to maximize whatever is left of their value. So you can't lose this fight and then find another big fight. I mean, Cotto could fight Canelo, but it wouldn't be the kind of money that he wanted if he loses this fight. And Martinez could maybe find something, but again, it wouldn't be the kind of money that he'd really like to have if he loses this fight. If the winner of this fight is going to find some kind of a big money fight, as long as they want it. Martinez will have one fight left on an HBO deal. Maybe that would come against Gennady Golovkin, which would, in theory, be sort of a passing of the torch at 160, unless Martinez beats him, which is, I still think, quite possible. Golovkin hasn't really fought a whole lot of guys that are, good.
Deteriorated. He's deteriorated technically too. He's another guy who learned that he could knock everybody out, and now he relies on it.
And I that's something I've kind of noticed in the last few fights as well. And again, I don't think it helps these guys to match them so soft the way that a lot of his fights have been, especially the fights in Monte Carlo, which I get are just for money and to stay active, but it doesn't help him to fight Usmanu Adama. But anyway, so we don't get going on Golovkin like I did it with Donaire. But, Cotto coming in at 155, interesting, because I think it proves that Miguel Cotto understands what this fight is for him. He's just going to go out there and try to be the absolute best he can be. He's not trying to bulk up to make himself more of a middleweight because he's not a middleweight. So, I mean, why try to do that? And I think we've seen, especially with Juan Manuel Marquez, he'll fight with a welterweight limit, but he'll come in at 143, 144 because that's where he's most comfortable. That's where he's not, losing weight, not losing muscle, not, cutting, and he's just coming in kind of how he would be if he never had to cut for a fight. So with Cotto, I think we're seeing sort of the same thing. Martinez came in, I think it was a quarter pound under the weight limit, which is 159, because Cotto could make it 159 to make the fight, so why not? And I don't think that's going to bother Martinez at all. He's never really been a 160 guy either. He's a small middleweight. The thing with Cotto is that he's a small junior middleweight. Cotto wasn't even that big as a welterweight. So I think what's going to happen in this fight depends entirely on what Sergio Martinez has left and how he's feeling physically. It's been a little over a year since he's been in the ring, and I thought he looked really not, I thought he looked bad against Martin Murray. I mean, I'll just put it like that. I thought it wasn't that he didn't look very good. It's that he looked bad. Martin Murray's a decent fighter and a physical, legitimate middleweight who is able to kind of push Martinez around in that fight. I don't think Cotto is able to do that in this fight, but if it does stay inside, Miguel Cotto is a better inside fighter than Sergio, and by a lot, especially, now that he's got Freddie Roach kind of hammering in, go to the body, go to the body, go to the body, and that's when Miguel Cotto was at his very best. He was a destroyer at 140. He was a very good puncher at 147. At 154, we've seen him, until he fought Delvin Rodriguez with Roach, we've kind of seen Miguel try to turn into more of a boxer first. He's paid more attention to his defense, and I think some of that did help. And I think it was good, especially with the Margarito rematch, because if Miguel Cotto had fought like he did against Delvin Rodriguez against Antonio Margarito, he probably would have gotten knocked out again, even though Margarito had one eye. And it wasn't, for that fight, I think that Pedro Diaz's boxing first style and approach benefited Miguel Cotto, but overall I don't think that's Miguel Cotto's best game. At 160, 159, whatever, here against Martinez, if Martinez is 80% of the guy who fought the first 11 rounds against Chavez, he's going to win this fight. If Miguel Cotto can hang in there and he comes out with an opponent who's not, physically there, if the knee's still bad, that's going to take away Martinez's legs. And I think that's when he's at his best, is when he can dictate all of the distance in a fight, and he uses his legs to do that, and he's able to kind of dart in and out and throw those left hands over the top and kind of come up with the angles with the right hand that he can use. He'll be able to win this fight if he can still do those things. I don't know if he can still do those things. I mean, we didn't see it against Murray. But I think starting with the 12th round against Chavez, that was sort of Sergio Martinez's career slipping away from him, and it's too bad because we only got a few years where we got to go, oh, this guy is really, really good, and he's a very unique, interesting, exciting fighter. But, everyone passed on him. I mean, Top Rank had a chance to sign him years ago. They had him showcased on their awful Versus series. I remember he was on that show. He didn't stand out to me either. I'm not saying I saw anything. Top Rank just decided to pass on a guy who was already in his 30s without a fan base, without much on paper marketability in the United States. I mean, who would really go out of their way to sign that guy? So Lukovic took him to DiBella. DiBella took a chance on him because DiBella has more time and more whatever to invest in sort of an unlikely star, and Martinez became that guy. I mean, DiBella and Lukovic saw something that nobody else was really seeing. I'd seen him a few times. I didn't see anything particularly special. When he got bumped up to fight Paul Williams when Kelly Pavlik pulled out, I expected that to be a fairly, easy win for Paul Williams. Paul Williams made it the type of fight that Paul Williams tended to make fights, so it wasn't easy. And that made Martinez. And then a few months later, he got to beat Kelly Pavlik, and he looked great in that fight. And I think that was basically the last stand of Kelly Pavlik. So, with Martinez, it's an incredibly talented fighter. He's one of the few guys that can reliably, and we talked about this a little in a couple of other fights that we've just discussed. He can rely on his athleticism, because his athleticism is that good. And Freddie Roach has always said he's not a great boxer, but he's a great athlete. And Freddie kind of means that as sort of a slight, but we all understand that Freddie Roach knows what he's seeing, and he knows that this is a good, effective fighter. So I think if Martinez is 80% of who he was at his best, he's going to win this fight going away. I think he'll be too fast, too physically imposing against Miguel Cotto. This is a chance for Sergio Martinez to be, the physically bigger man that can bully a fight, which is very rare for him, especially fighting at 160, where he's always been small. With Miguel Cotto, though, again, with Cotto, I think we know what we're going to get. We're going to get some approximation of the guy that fought Delvin Rodriguez, probably mixed with the guy that fought Margarito the second time. So I think we kind of know that Miguel Cotto is a 7.5 or an 8 out of a 10 kind of a fighter at this point. It will depend entirely on how good Sergio Martinez is.
And I think you hit the nail on the head there. Obviously, the biggest talking point about this fight is Martinez's decline physically. And, when you mention that he's a fighter whose career has been built on athleticism, it's absolutely true. His entire style hinges on that athleticism, which is why it's so worrying that athleticism might be failing him now.
Right.
He's 39 years old. It's not surprising that might happen, but he has a young man's boxing style. And if his knees aren't working, if he's, his last two performances where he looked underwhelming, and I really think he would have looked worse against Chavez had Chavez not spent his entire preparation eating pizza rolls and getting high, which was basically what he did to train for that fight. So, and Chavez showed that when he suddenly was like, well, I guess I'll try to knock him out, and almost did. So,
if Chavez had started doing that in round 5, that fight wouldn't have gone past 8. I mean, he would have won that fight because he was just bigger, stronger, and he could physically overwhelm Sergio Martinez. And, with Martinez, look, he's not Roy Jones. He's not that level of a fighter. But when Roy Jones's athleticism started going because he was getting older, Jones was done. I mean, he was just immediately finished as a top guy. He was, once you get Roy Jones getting beaten up by guys like Denis Lebedev, who's a decent fighter and a bigger guy than Roy because he's a legitimate cruiserweight. But, I would have picked a 160-pound Roy to beat a 200-pound Lebedev if they were both in their primes. I mean, and it wouldn't have been close. It would have looked a lot like when Jones went up to heavyweight to fight John Ruiz. He was just so much better that the size difference didn't really matter that much because Ruiz couldn't do anything with him. So, I mean, I always think about Roy Jones when I see these guys who are so predominantly athletic in their style like Martinez is. And once that goes, man, that's pretty much it for these guys. So with Martinez, if it's there, hopefully, for his sake, that it is to at least some degree. I don't think he's in a position with this fight where he's going to get hurt or get beaten up if he's not there. I mean, he could get stopped, but I don't think he's in any grave danger with this fight. But eventually, someone's going to just flat knock him out if that's gone. And we saw that with Roy Jones, who it's easy now to kind of forget how dominant and how spectacular he was against some really good fighters that he just clowned. I mean, he just made these guys look like nothing. And, Sergio was able to do that against some pretty decent fighters too, and not totally dominate them, but he's able to beat up a bigger, stronger Kelly Pavlik when Pavlik was still some approximation of a good fighter. Sure. He knocked out Paul Williams with one punch, and Paul Williams is a hell of a fighter. And if that's there, great, he'll win the fight. If it's not, he's not going to win this fight, and it could get ugly pretty quick for him. I mean, if his legs just aren't there and he gets caught inside with Miguel Cotto, I don't care how tall he is, and I don't care if he outweighs Miguel Cotto by 15 or 20 pounds, which I don't think he's going to do anyway, but he's not going to win an inside fight, and if he can't keep it at the distance he needs, he'll lose this fight to Miguel Cotto, who will then, immediately vacate his middleweight titles and look for probably a fight with Canelo if he can do that. I mean, Cotto's obviously not going to go, let's fight Gennady Golovkin for the middleweight title. No, Cotto's not stupid. I mean, it's a bad matchup stylistically with Martinez. They think they see a guy who's 39 years old. He's not, the most physically imposing middleweight to begin with. And they're taking a chance on a guy who's pretty much broken down, or at least that's what they think he is. So, again, and I can say this so many times, but it's all about what Sergio Martinez is tomorrow night.
Absolutely, and I think that this is the perfect fight choice for Cotto, because when they were talking about whether he was going to fight Martinez or Canelo, I have no doubt that Canelo would beat Miguel Cotto. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. Whether the fight was at 152 or whatever, I think that Canelo would probably knock Miguel Cotto out. Sergio Martinez, I'm going out of focus there. Sergio Martinez, on the other hand, is a guy who I I mean, you say it's all about the athleticism. I actually see some things here that I think might make this a pretty compelling stylistic matchup. Obviously, normally that would be outweighed by the size advantage because Martinez really did look a lot bigger than Cotto at the weigh-ins. But then with that Martinez being a little less athletic than he once was, that does, I guess, make it a pretty close matchup. I think that Cotto's style is a style that you can hang on to into your veteran years more than Martinez's by far.
Yes.
Being a guy who can come forward and beat people up and maul them, you're going to have old man strength forever. Whereas Sergio Martinez no longer has young man speed. It's gone.
Nobody has old man legs. I mean, exactly. When you get those, that's not a good thing.
Old man legs is never a compliment. Whereas Cotto, I think, still hits hard, and I think that Cotto still has enough power to hurt Sergio Martinez, and that we really just haven't been seeing it because he kind of ditched his aggressive style for a few years. And while it may have served him well it was a perfect choice against Margarito, but honestly, I think that the big narrative here that really interests me is less Martinez's decline and more Cotto matching up with Freddie Roach, because the more I think about it, it's kind of a dream matchup. Roach is a guy who specializes in just aggressive fighters and getting guys who like to beat their opponents up and making them very good at it, and also making them defensively responsible while they do so, because Manny Pacquiao is very good at maintaining his defense and shifting from hip to hip. He's a very difficult target even as he whoops your ass at full speed.
Absolutely.
And so to imagine Cotto doing that, it's not just a return to an old style. It's now Cotto with the style that he was best with even better strategy than before, because Freddie Roach is an excellent trainer, and he's going to be – Martinez is the kind of guy who will get you out of your game plan, hanging his hands low, sticking his chin out. He's going to get you to fight his fight, but having Roach in the corner to say, do not fall for that, keep attacking the body, keep coming forward, trap him in the corners. Roach is going to be keeping Cotto's head in the right place in this fight, because we all know that Cotto is a notoriously emotional fighter.
Yes.
Who, without somebody with the cool head of Roach in his corner, would get picked apart by Martinez. So to me, the big story of this fight is Roach. I think that Roach is going to make a big difference. I personally have been feeling since this fight was announced that Cotto could do it, and I know it's a long shot, but I admire Cotto. What I saw in the Delvin Rodriguez fight, even though Rodriguez is nowhere near Martinez's level, nor his size, I still think that that's the kind of style that could really tear apart somebody like Martinez, who no longer has the athleticism that his style is built on. So I'm going to go ahead and pick Cotto. I'm going to pick Cotto by a late stoppage, and I know that's a long shot, but it sounds like you're going with Martinez.
I am. I'm. You know, and I agree that when this fight was made, I thought it was interesting, and I thought Miguel Cotto had a really good shot, and I still think he has a very good shot of winning this fight. I'm leaning towards Sergio, though, and I don't think he's going to stop him. I think it's going to be a competitive fight. I think we might see a little controversy here. You know, the first thought would be that if we're going to get controversial scorecards at Madison Square Garden in a Miguel Cotto fight, they'll go to Miguel Cotto. Yeah. But I'm looking at something maybe 7-5, 8-4 for Sergio Martinez. Frankly, I think he could totally dominate this fight if he's again 80% of of Sergio Martinez that we saw those first 11 rounds with Chavez, and before that the guy who was dominating from 2010 to 2012. That guy is going to, if he's there, that guy will pick Miguel Cotto apart through this whole fight. He could win a shutout. I mean, I think it would be that much of a physical and stylistic mismatch at that point. If the legs are still there, if his speed is still there, then that's great. However, I have no idea what Sergio Martinez can still do in the ring. I mean, I really don't. We're talking about knee surgeries on a guy who relies on his legs. So, and he's 39 years old. I mean, he's not 31 and just had a weird knee thing and had to go in and get some. He had to get his knee scoped or anything like that. He's 39 years old with bad knees.
He tore his meniscus, isn't he? And it was the same injury twice. He's had the same exact laundry list of injuries in his past 2 fights, and the second time around it put him out for 13 months. And anybody who's like I can't think of any boxers that come to mind right now, but anybody who's a fan of MMA knows that, like Shogun Rua, for example, mixed martial artist who also relied on his athleticism and his legs, and after his first knee surgery, he was never the same.
Right, and knees never completely heal the way that you're going to need them to if you're going to be a top-level professional athlete, especially not when you're nearing 40 years old. Right. And I think that's the chance that Cotto has in this fight, is if Sergio is not who he used to be, and if he just can't pull down. And honestly, I think another thing that could really go Cotto's favor is if Sergio realizes within 3 or 4 rounds that he doesn't have what he used to have. It's different in the ring against a guy like Miguel Cotto than it was in the gym, or it was just working out or sparring or whatever. Because Miguel Cotto's coming at him 100% to hurt him. If Sergio realizes he doesn't have what he used to have, that could take him out of the fight mentally, which could take him out of the fight physically in a hurry. I mean, because Miguel Cotto is not going to stand there and look at him not being able to do what he used to do. I mean, he's going to start attacking him. He's going to go right at him. And I agree with what you said about him and Freddie Roach as a pairing. I think it's a great pairing. Miguel Cotto pretty much knows what he's doing in the ring, and he's learned various styles from various trainers over the years. Freddie Roach knows how to zero in. I don't think he's taken away what Pedro Diaz, for instance, was able to improve upon with Cotto. I thought they were a good pairing too, but long term, I think Miguel Cotto has to be that aggressive, attacking sort of fighter that looks to the body punches and looks to wear down opponents and break them and just beat them up. And I think stylistically, he's got the right style for Sergio Martinez. I don't know if he's going to be big enough, and I don't know if Miguel still has enough to get through what could be a tough fight. I mean, if both of them are kind of at the same level, I favor Sergio Martinez because I think he's just got the height, the reach, the athleticism to stay out of the pocket and keep Miguel Cotto at bay, something like we saw with Austin Trout, who a pretty good fighter, but not a Sergio Martinez. And Austin Trout was able to get a decision over Miguel Cotto at Madison Square Garden in a fight that I thought Trout clearly won, but going to the cards, I was a little worried because it was Miguel Cotto at Madison Square Garden as the money fighter, and Austin Trout was the B-side even though he had the title, which is the same thing that we've got now. But Sergio Martinez, bigger name, and has a bigger money future ahead. So if he can win this fight, I mean, it's a short-term future, but Martinez winning this fight gives him a big money fight. Cotto winning gives him a big money fight. I think we're going to see these guys pretty much leave whatever they have to leave in the ring to win this fight, because otherwise their future is very, very murky.
Absolutely, and I do think the fight is a little personal. There's some hype there, but I think that both Martinez and Cotto are emotional guys. I think that Martinez was genuinely offended by the fact that he was not billed as the champion. He's not been treated as the champion. The card is not Martinez versus Cotto. It's Cotto versus Martinez. And I think that both guys have emotions and their pride as well as the entire future, as you mentioned, of their boxing career. Their entire ability to get any big money fights in the future hinges on this. So I really think we're going to see a competitive matchup with both guys trying in earnest to beat each other definitively. So I'm looking forward to it. Both guys, Cotto's a puncher who can box. Martinez is a boxer who can fight. And both guys are past it, but it's a very compelling style matchup. Very important fight personally for both fighters. So this is a big one. It's a good pay-per-view, I think, to follow up on the two great ones that we've already had this year. Yeah, so good continuation for 2014, even though things in boxing's future with the Golden Boy split
it's a mess right now overall.
May be difficult for some time. But at least we can cherish what we have so far. So thanks, folks, for joining us for this preview of the Cotto versus Martinez pay-per-view card. I'm Connor Rebush. This has been Scott Christ. You can find both of us on Bad Left Hook, and you can also find me on Bloody Elbow. I'm on Twitter as Boxing Bush, B-U-S-C-H. Scott, what's your Twitter handle?
Scott Chris BLH.
Okay, and you can find both of us. We'll probably be tweeting throughout the fights. And, of course, you can go to Bad Left Hook for your play-by-play and a recap video after the fight as well, I believe. So we'll at least one of us will be sharing our thoughts after the bout. So thanks for joining us today. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoy the fights. Adios.